Hey there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back. It's another Red Pill Religion podcast. Red Pill Religion, where amongst the many things we say are that belief in the supernatural and transcendent is normal, healthy, rational, and evidence-based in adults and children. So please support our work on redpillreligion.com. Redpillreligion.com, where in these days of social media censorship, you will find, we believe we're reasonably secure there, and we post new videos by us and others, and articles by us and others every day. We could use your spiritual as well as your financial support. We take donations via PayPal and Patreon at this time, and Bitcoin. We're drop maker support. We are looking into other funding vehicles. If we are taken out of YouTube, which we've had several threats to, we're already being mirrored on BitChute and looking at other platforms to be on as well. Please also find us on Gab AI at Red Pill Religion. Find us on Discord at Red Pill Religion, where we still have, not for much longer, but we still have a free to the public Discord chat server where you can come in and we talk to people of all sorts of viewpoints. We have deists, atheists who aren't hostile, agnostics, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, Christians of various sorts. Anybody is welcome to come on in and talk about ideas. We particularly like talking about history, science, and philosophy, as well as theology and even some nerd stuff. So please feel free to join. Eventually, you're going to need to be an official member to get in there. So getting in is going tight. Now, I meant to pull up a copy of our guest's channel today to show. It will be on the blog. It will be on the blog, and it will be on. It is already in the show notes here. So please be sure to check out TJump's channel. Can we call you Tom?
Sure.
Tom Jump. Nice to meet you, sir. And I got an email from. I believe you sent us the email and said you were interested in coming on and discussing the religion in God and supernatural question. So I noticed that on your channel you talk about science and pseudoscience in Christian apologetics. Now, for the record, we do very little Christian apologetics here because we actually defend religious views and religion generally, including all the ones I've mentioned before. I'm actually curious, what's your take on science and its applicability or non-applicability to, I guess, Christian apologetics? Tom?
Well, it depends on what you mean by Christian apologetics. My perspective is that science is a methodology that can tell us about the natural world, but it doesn't tell us anything necessarily about what the fundamental nature of reality is. And so it just leaves that question open to interpretation and doesn't say anything about that at all.
Well, that's an interesting way of putting it, because from where I sit, what I have noticed, I've even seen it somewhat in my lifetime, and you can certainly see it in the history of science, and especially how scientific language and terminology and presuppositions changed, particularly over the 20th century, and especially even more over the last couple of decades. It used to be, historically, that you had, science was viewed as a subset of philosophy, and it was called natural philosophy. And implicit in that assumption was, is the best I understand it, and I've got a lot of sources on this, it used to be just assumed that there were things that were supernatural, which were therefore definitionally beyond the scope of science to speak of one way or the other, because science had to restrict itself to the natural, which was understood to be the physical. And that which was beyond the physical, or beyond what we call physics now, would be called the supernatural. And what I've noted is that most of what much, if not most of what we seem to accept as contemporary science now, is often not measuring things that are material at all, or subject to the laws of physics at all, yet we accept them as science. And so it seems to me a subtle change in what we mean by science has come in, to the point where we think we can exclude ideas and say, well, that's not scientific because you don't have an empirical basis for that. But I see all kinds of things that we accept in science that we don't have physical empirical bases for. Merely, for one example I like to use is economics. Another one is most of the field of psychology. Actually, I would not even count most of psychology as science at all. But what little you could call science within psychology isn't measuring anything physical that the researchers can show much of the time. Unless, of course, you start getting in neuroscience and stuff like that. So I have a problem with the whole attitude that everything, to me, it all gets down to the philosophy of science known as scientific naturalism. And I simply don't accept scientific naturalism as either scientific or even defensible at this point. I think that when we have, for example, the very rigorous and well done peer-reviewed studies on near-death experience, just to grab one, for example, the scientific naturalist attempts to explain away that data. A, they fail, and B, they look intensely ideological and not scientific at all. And in fact, that indeed has been one of my problems with atheists, even presupposing that they get to speak as if they own science, or that you can't use science to prove things like the existence of probably something intelligent operating the universe, or the strong evidence that we have that there is a life after death. I don't see how you call that not scientific unless you throw out quite a few other areas of the contemporary sciences that we do accept as science. That's kind of how I see it.
All right, so let me give you an outline of my position. Okay. I am an atheist, and by an atheist, what I mean is that I don't believe there is any evidence or argument that indicate the existence of God. I tend to agree with most of the prominent atheists on that definition. For example, in your case of near-death experiences, my understanding is that because it's not testable and repeatable in some sense, it's not really much different from homeopathy or dowsing, where it's made some pretty interesting claims that would be cool if it was true, but when it's put into a rigorous scientific test by people who don't already accept it, they aren't really able to verify that it's true. So I don't see that as real evidence that there is anything beyond the physical. Like near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences don't seem to me to be any different than homeopathy or dowsing. It's just not really testable in any way.
Okay. Well, just to make it clear, I certainly don't rest alone on near-death experience research for the evidence, which, having changed my mind on atheism and looked at the massive amounts of evidence that we do have, the near-death experience research simply is one of many, but probably the most easy to grasp for the actual person to look at. Because when I look at attempts to explain away the near-death experience data, I'm completely unconvinced that the so-called skeptics, the so-called debunkers, are anything other than ideological, because I catch them simply misrepresenting what is in the peer-reviewed research and what is in the NDE data. And I think that what I keep finding is, this isn't the only case that's like this, but I see no rational or scientific justification whatsoever for you to dismiss the NDE data, which is comprehensive and is as comprehensive as any medical tracking survey used for, say, drug trial tracking or psychological interventions. It's at least as rigorous as what you find in quite a few other fields. I think you are misrepresenting, in fact, what the data is. We know from the data, the testing on this, that pretty much everything you just said isn't true about the near-death experience, peer-reviewed scientific data. So you just right there said something that isn't true, and I don't know where to go from there, because we have already seen the ridiculous attempts to for example, no, the near-death experience research clearly does not indicate that it has to do with pre-existing belief. You can't get it down to electrochemical effect. You can't get it down to delusion. And the claim that it's all lies or fantasy, all by itself, demands proof. I've looked extensively at this research, and I have seen time after time, and I'm not the only one to observe this. I can point you to others. I have seen time after time after time, every prominent so-called scientist debunker of the near-death experience research clearly and irrefutably misrepresents what's in the data. And quite a few of them who have been famous have been shown to have not even reviewed the data or talked to the patients. And so I think it is actually on the deniers of the data to prove why we should deny this evidence. And I certainly laugh at anybody who claims it's not evidence. That's, to me, just a rhetorical trick. It is utterly and irrefutably evidence. I don't see how you get away with claiming it's not.
Well, let me start with that. When you say, so if you had a box and somebody claimed there was a rabbit in the box, and they said the reason there's a rabbit in the box is because it weighs 2 pounds. I mean, it would be reasonable to conclude that's not evidence of a rabbit, because there are lots of different things that can explain that 2 pounds, right? You would consider it reasonable to believe that isn't evidence of rabbit, correct?
Okay, wait a minute. Say that again. I want to make sure I understood it.
So if we have a box and somebody claims there is a rabbit in the box, and the evidence they present for this is that it weighs 2 pounds, I mean, that's not actually evidence of a rabbit, because there are lots of different things that could explain that 2 pounds.
Sure.
So my position of atheism, the reason I don't believe there's any evidence for a God or the transcendental, is the same kind of a thing. I think that all this evidence that you're presenting can be explained by infinitely many different mutually exclusive explanations. There's no reason to jump to the conclusion of a God based off that, from my perspective. Well, so is that at least coherent from your perspective?
At least coherent, but the rabbit might in fact still be in the box is one of the things I'd first point out. And second, I'm sorry, the evidence is quite, I mean, I would actually just recommend at this point that you go and actually look at the near-death experience research.
I'm familiar with all of it, thank you, yes.
So we've ruled out the electrochemical claim. We've ruled out the claim that it's neurological effects. You don't have an infinite number of alternative explanations. You have very few.
Well, let's start with that.
Case.
So,
okay.
My epistemology starts with the idea there is some difference between my imagination and my experience. When I imagine a unicorn, I don't experience seeing a unicorn. I mean, you're with me with that so far?
Sure.
All right, and the next one is there are infinitely many ways to explain literally anything. Like, for example, if we see a cup fall over, maybe it was knocked over by someone who bumped the table, or the wind, or a mouse, or a squirrel, or psychic powers, or magic, or leprechauns, or maybe the whole world was created 5 minutes ago and the cup was already laying on its side and the memories of seeing it were just illusory. Or maybe the world was created 6 minutes ago, or 7 minutes ago, or 30 leprechauns. I mean, there are just infinitely many ways to explain how that happened. You still with me?
On a case like that, yeah.
And this doesn't just apply to cups, this applies to literally anything. The origin of the universe, the near-death experiences, the objective morality, the fine-tuning, just literally anything has infinitely many ways to explain it.
I don't find that claim all that convincing, unless you're just going into rather ludicrous assumptions that no one would support. I mean, it is perfectly rational to think that there's an afterlife. And that there are things beyond laws of physics.
Go back a little bit. So you said you don't find it reasonable that there are infinitely many ways to explain anything. Could you give me a more specific example? Like, couldn't I just say the entire universe?
I do not think you have an infinite number of ways of explaining away the near-death experience data that we've seen.
The entire universe.
You misstated what's in the near-death experience research. I will repeat, you have misstated it.
Well, I don't think I've stated anything about the research yet. I've just stated my position on it.
You said something about how it had something to do with what people already believed, and that's already debunked. That's not.
Oh, no. I said that the only people who have been able to confirm it are people who already believe it. The people who try to test it who don't already believe it don't find any meaningful results. I wasn't actually saying the tests themselves are something in somebody's head.
Well, all I can tell you there is that what I see is what looks like just absolute denialism of what the data clearly affirms in my mind, as I've looked at it.
Okay, well, let's go back to the infinitely many ways to explain anything. Why do you reject that? So you said you don't think I have infinitely many ways to
theoretically, I suppose you have an infinite number of reasons, especially when you start invoking, I don't know, infinite universes and
the whole world was created 5 seconds ago, 6 seconds ago.
Right. So 7. Yeah, I mean, you can go to that level if you want to. Sure. The whole thing's an illusion. Everything's being imagined. Yeah, you can certainly go that with anything.
Oh,
So
absolutely. So we need some way to differentiate between the reasonable explanations and just the imaginary ones, because presumably all of these except like one are imaginary, right?
all of these,
All of the infinitely many different ways to explain it, they're all imaginary except for the one truth, right?
it depends on the case because I'm open to the idea that there are multiple universes. But okay, let's stick within a single universe. Yeah, sure. Probably only one.
Okay, so we need some criteria to differentiate between the reasonable beliefs and the just the imaginary ones.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, the method I use to do that is testable predictions in science. I believe the correct way to assess whether or not an explanation is a reasonable to believe one or a imaginary one is testable predictions. And from my experience, when I looked at the near-death experience and out-of-body experience data, the people who tried to make testable predictions and verify this just consistently fail.
Well, my read of the data, especially Jeffrey Long's data, is that he consistently has succeeded and has continued since his first release of his work to show how the predictable patterns of what near-death experiences look like continue to be predictable.
Absolutely.
So,
I'm familiar with his work, but so has Deepak Chopra when he says that he can support panpsychism, and so has all the homeopathers when they say they can support homeopathy. The fact that the person who already believes it can confirm it isn't really evidence from my perspective. It has to be confirmed by other people, by the peer review, by people outside of who already believe it. So if there are people like in other countries all over the world who are testing this and found out that, oh yeah, this really works, that would be compelling evidence for me. But it seems like the vast majority of every scientific community all over the world don't really accept this. Now, I'm not in a position where I can actually.
I don't accept that assertion either, but go on.
So I'm not in a position where I can actually do the test myself. So I can't actually verify whether or not it's true. Like if I could actually do the funding and do the test, that would be good evidence that it's either true or false for me. But when I look at all of the data and the larger scientific community, it seems like the vast majority of everyone around the world doesn't seem to agree with this.
Well, those are very big words, seems like, and scientific community, and I don't accept your assertions on either one of those. I'm sorry. It's very clear that most of the so-called scientific community doesn't exist as a coherent community and has no particular right to an opinion until they have researched the data. I have verified myself, as have others, that multiple so-called debunkers of near-death experiences outright lie about the data for apparently ideological reasons. And I think at some point it is time for the atheist and the denier to accept the burden of proof for their claims that they can explain these away and that they can get everything down to scientific naturalism, which just presupposes everything is subject to the laws of physics and that nothing supernatural exists. And there's nothing particularly logical, evidence-based, or scientific about any of those presuppositions. They're just presuppositions, and they're ideological and philosophical.
So you could be right that there are many naturalists who just lie about it. That's totally possible. But since his work is available,
we know some of them do for a fact, and I'll back that up. No problem.
Well, there's always some group of people who lie about everything, but so his work is available publicly, so anybody can look at his work and try and replicate it in a lab condition. But no one seems to be doing this for the most part.
Wait a minute. Actually, I can tell you that it's that the who's the big medical people up in Minnesota? Oh my God, everybody's heard of this. The Mayo Clinic. They're opening up serious studies on near-death experience.
Cool. Love to see the results they have, but until then, from what I know, I can only go off based off of what I know, and it seems more likely that it just doesn't add up to anything than that everyone in the world is just lying about this. Because it seems to me when I look at all of the data and all of the different scientific communities who are completely separate from one another, you're right, they're not like a cohesive community. They all seem to reject the idea of near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. It seems to be only religious people in general seem to adopt this. And so from my perspective, it seems more likely that it's not reasonable. But again, I can't verify it myself. That's just kind of, we'll have to just disagree on that part.
Well, yeah, because I hear a lot of seems to be to you, and I keep, hearing arguments from authority of what seems to be happening in other fields of science. But what I'm seeing is quite a bit of increasing interest and people taking it seriously. And what I am seeing is undeniably ideological, materialist, scientific naturalist atheists simply denying what is obviously there in the research. This kind of is part of the reason that got me away from atheism in the first place, when I realized how intensely ideological atheism was for so many people. And that's when it finally clicked to me that, atheism is merely a presupposition about the universe and not necessarily the most rational, logical, or evidence-based presupposition about the universe. What got me interested originally was evolutionary biology, which convinced me there had to be something necessary, vital, and important. And watching the behavior of atheists in groups and seeing the behavior I saw, and looking at the history of it, I just decided, I didn't jump to any religion. I just decided atheism does not make sense and I don't want to be called one anymore. And that's kind of where my search began over 10 years ago. Subsequently, I've simply found that presuppositional atheism is just that. It's presupposition. It's not necessarily the most logical, rational, or sensible one. It's very much a minority opinion. There's various surveys that you can look at to see how scientists feel on the question or not, but a mature understanding of God can't be in conflict with science because it merely supposes that something intelligent is operating the laws of physics and probability, which makes a great deal of sense logically and to me, and I see lots of other evidence for that in other areas. And what I think, one of the things I keep finding over and over again is that the atheist, who is always working from a presuppositional and ideological position, without exception, always, wants to psychologize away any explanation and say that it's just me or it's just my fellow religionists who accept this evidence as if there's something wrong with us. Yet the atheist is just kind of presupposed to be the rational, arbitral, neutral person in the room, and he's not. What I look at in the history of science, it's only been in the last couple of generations that scientific naturalists have been riding into town claiming that they've explained the universe and that they can get everything down to psychology and material effects. And as the scientific naturalists have risen within the scientific community, it has become apparent to me that science, both the quality of science and what we might call the progress of science, have slowed down. Which is why I noticed that so many scientists now are holding conferences on how to ditch scientific naturalism because it doesn't make any sense to them. I think really scientific naturalists themselves really need to stop presupposing their own correctness, because that's how it seems to me they get away with everything. They like to atomize the evidence so that they'll take the evidence in any one area and find a million explain-awayers of the evidence there. And then you go to another area of the dozens and hundreds of areas where we have evidence and find explain-awayers for the evidence in all these other areas. And then rather dishonestly claim, therefore, because I can personally find, or me and my friends can find alternative explanations for all these little different things we've atomized, there is no evidence. And I'm sorry, but the no evidence claim is just ludicrous on its face. We have evidence that there's an afterlife, and we have evidence that there are elements that transcend or are beyond the laws of physics. We have evidence for these propositions. We always have for thousands of years, and we have it in contemporary science today.
Okay, so let me interject there. So I think most of what you said is a misrepresentation of atheism and naturalism, just like how you believe that what I said is a misrepresentation of the near-death experiences stuff. So I don't think we're going to agree on that stuff. So from my perspective, the near-death experiences has absolutely no evidence for the supernatural. It's just an unexplained event, and until I can see testable predictions, I'm never going to believe it. So if the Mayo Clinic stuff works out, then that's awesome. I'd love to see it, but until then, I'm not going to accept it. Do you have any other reason to believe in the supernatural or a god of some kind?
Do we have any other reason?
Yeah, you said there's lots of other reasons. You don't just do it based off near-death experiences. What are the other reasons?
Well, okay, if we're just going to stick with contemporary science, which we certainly can, we would look at, we could talk about so many areas. My main one, and this would be one where, this is where my journey actually started, was the science we've had for the last few years, which matches what we've seen reported culturally for thousands of years, is that most humans are naturally born with an instinct to seek out and believe the supernatural elements do exist, and that something like a god, or spirits must exist. This research has been done by multiple clinical
Sure.
psychologists showing that this is a natural tendency children develop between the ages, usually around the same age as language development. And the fact that we would evolve a sense of something that is simply delusional, and is somehow both a delusion but functional for survival, but ultimately deadly and toxic. I heard that kind of reasoning coming out of Dawkins, who, by the way, is a pseudoscientist, and Daniel Dennett, who's not one necessarily. And I thought, really, so we evolved a functional delusion that made us better able to survive, but was ultimately destructive and awful and evil. And that's not what I see in the anthropological or archaeological record. Not my experience. And the claim that it's a delusion is merely a claim, one that I assert is without evidence.
All right, let me ask you a question. Do you think that all of the beliefs that are innate in humans are accurate?
All of the beliefs that are
I can't remember exactly the words you used, but you said something like humans innately have some belief.
It's an innate sense. It's an innate sense that we develop in childhood, independent of religious background, and including even in non-religious homes. Exceptions.
Okay. So do you think that all of the innate beliefs that humans develop are accurate?
I think all the innate senses that we believe that we develop are reasonably accurate to something. I mean, we know that the the child's developed of incoherent idea of a spiritual, and that something intelligent is running things. That's a very simple belief. Religious development or spiritual development forms from there.
Sure. We also
there's no justification for. I mean, really, there's no scientific justification, but arrogance to say that that's just that instinctive, intuitive sense is merely delusional. No justification for it.
So,
in fact, I'd call it child abuse to tell a child that that's delusional.
So
many atheists do that to children.
Okay. So we all innately have the belief that objects are solid, but if this water bottle I'm holding, we actually know it's not solid. 99% of it is empty space. That's an intuition that all human beings grow up with, but it's just false. So couldn't our belief in a God be the same way? It's just a kind of a useful fiction, as you pointed out from what Richard Dawkins said?
You would want to, I think you would have a burden of proof on that to say that it's simply delusional. And nobody in the atheist community can back up the delusion claim scientifically. It's just a presupposition, an entirely ideological one, not a scientific one.
You're right. We can't prove there is no God, that's for sure. But it could be.
You can't prove that the sense that there is one is a delusion or false.
Well, yeah, we'd have to do that. We'd have to prove there is no God.
Yeah. Now, that's something that you believe, but it's only a belief. It has no.
I believe it's a possibility. It's possible that our innate belief that there is a God is false, just like it's possible that our innate belief that all objects are solid is false.
Well, right, and we can get into weird areas of quantum physics on that one.
Well, no, I'm not even going into quantum physics.
I have to go in there, yeah.
So we know that there are innate beliefs that are false.
Name a few.
The fact that objects are solid, the fact that objects have colors, the fact that the wetness is a physical property. There's tons and tons and tons of these. Like most of the stuff.
They're all beliefs that are false?
Yes.
The wetness exists. Wait. Okay, those all sounded things like that are true to me. So
like objects are solid. Objects aren't solid. They're made of empty space. 99% of them, the space in between the electrons and the protons and neutrons is just empty space.
Okay, sure.
And there's no wetness isn't like a property of water. There is no hydrogen or oxygen molecule that has the property of wetness. It's just an emergent property that we sense from that's been built up through evolution to cause us useful fiction. It's not actually a property of water.
I see. So you're reducing everything down to atomics. I would expect a materialist naturalist to try to do that, but I think wetness is real, and and solid objects are solid. Just the fact that we know that under current theory, we think most of the space between the nucleus of the atom and the electrons is empty. It's something ridiculous, right? Like the electron shell is further out from the nucleus than Pluto is from us. From sort of thing. It is just huge empty space, but there's well, under current physics, I guess we propose the strong and weak nuclear forces for that. I mean, are the forces real? Do physical forces exist at all? Are they real?
I would say yes, but those
Okay,
are.
and so those physical forces get under that theory get together and form something that we would call solid, because we can't go through it, unless we find some way. So no, I think solidity even exists, even though we know within the atom there's a lot of empty space and there's space between
All right, let me
atoms.
use a different example. If I showed a picture of an optical illusion to someone like a kid before they actually knew about optical illusions, every single human being would intuitively think it's moving, but it would be false.
Sure.
And
Which is
that's a useful fiction that's been produced by our minds due to evolution because of the way our eyes process light and color and things. That benefits our survival, but it's not true.
it's a useful fiction. I guess so.
So
Uh,
there's
really, I mean, optical illusions are a useful fiction rather than simply a misperception that an analytical mind can look at and say, "Oh, look, it's not really moving." Okay, God's a useful fiction then.
so well, I was going to go a few more steps to get there, but so we know there are these certain kinds of similar biases like type 1 and type 2 errors, where if we hear a rustle in the bushes and we think it's a lion, we run away and survive. Where if we hear rustle in the bushes and think it's just the wind, then we get eaten by the lion. And so it behooves us, it is beneficial to us to seek agency in those kinds of things, like a being or a god, or when we see lightning, oh, it must have been a god. So seeing agency in things was beneficial to survival. So it seems like it could also justifiably be called a useful fiction, like illusions.
Okay. I don't know that optical illusions are useful to our survival. I don't know how they are, but all right. So other than that, okay. So we evolved a useful delusion, a sense of something that isn't there, that most of us have, that some of us are born without, like autistics and kids from abusive backgrounds are the most likely. I don't know. I still see a massive presupposition here. I mean, to me, when I look at the psychology of atheism, which is entirely interesting,
Well, I didn't mention atheism anything here. I'm not sure where you're going with this.
well, because everything you're doing presupposes a materialist worldview and a necessarily atheistic one.
Well, I didn't
Everything
presuppose anything there. I just said, based on the evidence we know of certain kinds of delusions that occur in humans naturally, and here are the reasons they occur. This has nothing to do with any presupposition. There could still be a God out there. There could still be a supernatural out there. I don't say there is no supernatural. I just say there's no evidence as far as I know. So I don't presuppose anything.
And that's kind of one of these things where we just can't agree. To me, it seems implicitly haughty and dishonest to just declare no evidence because you're not personally convinced by the evidence.
Oh yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. I'm saying that I am unaware of any evidence.
You're unaware of any evidence. Well, I mean, you were just given some and you declared that it's not. That's what I perceive.
Yes, I am aware of that, and it seems far more plausible of the naturalistic explanations that we already have an abundance of evidence for. So it's like if I said I saw a dog, it would be reasonable to believe me. But if I said I saw a unicorn, it would be unreasonable to believe me. The difference between these two claims is that dogs have an implicit empirical basis. There's lots of things about dogs we can verify and justify belief in, like their DNA, their taxonomy, their phylogeny, their bones, their fossils, all these kinds of things. And none of that exists for unicorns. So just simply the testimony of I saw a dog is sufficient because there's lots of empirical stuff behind that that isn't mentioned in the statement, whereas the statement I saw a unicorn isn't reasonable. So in the same case, I would say the innate belief of a being has lots of implicit empirical evidence that that's just a byproduct of evolution, because we know of type 1 and type 2 errors, which are a byproduct not only in humans, but also in other animals who do the exact same thing. So it seems reasonable to believe that's a product of evolution, just like it seems reasonable to believe someone if they say they see a dog. Whereas from my perspective, your claim seems to be more like, I saw a unicorn. Like there's this actually existing new category of thing that we don't seem to have any reason to believe, as far as I can tell.
So, okay, and all I notice is how many seems to me are coming out of you and what seems reasonable to you. And what seems reasonable to you is just going to be what seems reasonable to you. I think these are merely just your beliefs.
Well,
Again,
obviously, everything is naturally anything anyone ever says is always going to be what seems to be to them. So I'm not sure what your point is there.
well, there's nothing scientific about anything you said there.
Well, all of the
And
scientific evidence of the type 1 and type 2 errors, that's scientific, and that gives us a reason to justify belief in beings.
that is that is a that is a way for you to rationalize away the evidence, I suppose, but it's far from being demonstrated. I don't think you've demonstrated anything of the sort, and I haven't seen any atheist who's managed to demonstrate anything of the sort.
Well, there's a lot of evolutionary evidence on that topic. I can give you some sources if you want. I can look them up later, but yeah, that's a pretty big field that is pretty well supported.
I've looked at a lot of it, and I don't think it's supported at all. I think it's all presuppositional ideological nonsense, what I've seen so far. And I think it's why scientific naturalism is dying, to be honest with you, because by its own principles, scientific naturalism can't prove itself.
That's kind of strange, since most of the biggest scientific institutions are majority naturalists, and naturalism and atheism seem to be growing. But as far as I can tell, we have a system that works, that gives us testable predictions that we can then look back and say, hey, this gives us testable predictions, so we have a reason to believe it's not just imaginary, whereas your explanation doesn't seem to make any testable predictions. So I don't see any reason to believe that your explanation isn't just imaginary.
Okay. I think your explaining layers are entirely ideological. And you keep making statements about science and what's happening with science. What I notice is that scientific naturalists are a group of ideologues who rode into town, starting in roughly they were always there and they were always coming up, but they really rode into town and declared victory in the 1970s.
Well, that's just an ad hominem. So
no, it's not. I think scientific naturalists make claims for themselves that they can't back up. I've had scientific naturalists do it to me and try and throw the Big Bang Theory at me, quantum physics at me, modern medicine and genetics on scientific naturalism, and scientific naturalists can take credit for none of those fields.
So again,
what I have seen is what I no.
So that doesn't actually tell us anything about what's true or what's not true. Saying this scientist is bad or this scientist is mean or I don't like this scientist is irrelevant to the truth. So I don't care about what any mean scientist said. All I care about is the truth and the evidence. I consider evidence.
I didn't say that. Okay, go ahead.
So I consider evidence. We need some way to differentiate between our imagination and our experience. You agreed with me on that part. So the way I do that is through testable predictions. Evolution makes testable predictions. A being that we don't know about doesn't make testable predictions, as far as I know. So I have reason. I'd love to hear them. So I have reason to believe that the evolutionary explanation of type 1 and type 2 errors explains the perception of a being, because that makes testable predictions. Whereas I don't see any reason to believe that your explanation isn't just imaginary, because as far as I know, it doesn't make testable predictions. You said it does. What testable prediction does it make?
Wow. Okay. The idea that the being that we the maximal imaginable being, a being in control of absolutely everything, is testable. Well, actually, I would note for you that the axioms that scientific naturalism itself is based on are based on inherent theistic assumptions that actually do come out of the Christian faith, but not just the Christian faith.
I'm not sure what you
mean. The idea that the universe is orderly and intelligible and governed by orderly, intelligible rules all by itself is just a belief that it becomes axiomatic for modern science, but it's just a faith assumption.
So why do you believe that God is orderly or has some particular nature?
If we look at how God is universally understood across religions and most philosophies, it is generally presumed to be an ultimate intelligence that is driving everything, that drives everything, that makes it all go. I don't even see how you could posit that a random, causeless, unintelligent universe driven by blind natural forces could create or would create an orderly, intelligible universe.
So why would God create an orderly, intelligent universe?
Because God is orderly and intelligent.
So why can't I just say the universe is orderly and intelligent?
You can say that if you want, but you can't explain why. And now you're going to say science can't explain why, but
no. I was going to ask, how does God do it? How do you explain why God is orderly and what you said?
oh gosh. All right, you've got me. I can't. I've lost track of the conversation.
Okay,
Honestly,
let me. So you said that God created an orderly universe, and I'm saying that the universe.
intelligible. Yeah.
I'm saying that the universe is just a part of the universe's nature to be orderly, just like I think you believe it's a part of God's nature to be orderly. So what's the difference between those two claims?
I don't think an orderly, intelligible universe can come into existence or sustain itself without an ordering intelligence ultimately driving it. And I think that if we didn't have an orderly intelligence driving everything, the universe would dissolve into chaos, and we would not have the orderly predictability that we do, and science itself wouldn't work.
Okay, so from my perspective, there are many different religions around the world that just say it is orderly, that there's something above an intelligence or that there is no intelligence. For example, I agree that there has to be something eternal at the very least in some sense to ground everything. But that could be theism, but it could also be deism or pantheism, which is just a kind of eternal, all-powerful universe, or naturalistic pantheism, or transtheism, where there's something above a god, or polytheism with many gods, or ditheism, which is an evil god, or the spaghetti monster even. So
yeah, but you're okay. But you're putting some ideas which are more defensible on the same plane on indefensible or virtually indefensible grounds, and treating them all like they're all ultimately equal. Which is
yes, from my perspective,
that's a pattern of thinking I've seen over and over again.
Yes, from my perspective.
I'm sorry, but it's a category error. It's a category error to, compare something that you would be able to witness with your own eyes, like a unicorn, to an intelligence that's making all physical reality be here. That's not something you can design a physical test for, although you can certainly less for science of it.
I didn't say anything about a unicorn. I'm not sure I followed.
You've mentioned unicorns as an example before. I guess it's just a callback to that.
Okay, you're absolutely right.
If an intelligence is operating the universe, it's not going to be physical.
Yes, I agree with you. I'm not saying it is. So I'm saying that you could have a supernatural, all-powerful being like theism, or you could have a supernatural, all-powerful universe like pantheism.
Well, I find those defensible. I actually find pantheism rather more defensible than the spaghetti monster, for example.
Okay, I can understand that. So from my perspective, pantheism is a kind of metaphysical naturalism. Those two are compatible beliefs.
Yeah, but now you're out, and maybe we could stop there, because that's actually a place where we do agree. We have been going 45 minutes, and we might want to start wrapping here. We obviously don't see the world the same way, and we've challenged each other a few places. Do you want to wrap it up here? Maybe I'll even give you a final word, and maybe if we can review this and trade some notes, and if we want to come back, we will, and if we don't have to. And how's that sound?
Well, do you have some more time? Because I'd like to explore this idea a little bit more.
Okay, we can go another 5-10 minutes. Go ahead.
All right, so you agree that pantheism is potentially a defensible position?
Yeah, I don't think it works ultimately personally, but it's defensible.
So from my perspective, I think that all of the arguments and evidence and everything in the universe could be explained by pantheism or theism or deism or transtheism or henotheism, all these different ideas. And I don't think there's any reason to believe in theism over pantheism, just like I don't believe there's any reason to believe there is a rabbit in the box rather than a lizard in the box.
To some extent, what I see a lot of what you're doing there is just atomizing and trying to make all ideas look equally implausible or plausible when you do something like that. That's what it looks like to me when I see atheists raise this line of argument. It's like the whole ludicrous 4,000 gods, 4,000 religions, and only yours is correct. And I'm like, the answer to that is and so all of them are wrong and you're right. I mean, I think it was Vox Day, who I don't agree on a great many things, but he's the one that pointed out that most of Western science has implicitly assumed the existence of a God and the existence of purpose in nature, and has produced most of what we have in modern science, as opposed to scientific naturalists who have produced quite a bit less than they like to lay claim to, in my observations over the years.
But that's just a bandwagon fallacy. Most people used to believe that the sun rotated around the Earth. That doesn't actually make it true.
And the same is true when you try to tell me that all these institutions are run by scientific naturalists.
Well,
and that means nothing. In fact, I merely note again the
interest
of the scientific naturalists seems to very visibly, to my eye, they're the ones who have presided over the meltdown of the peer review system that we've seen all over the place.
Okay, but that's again. So my position is that we have a box. Somebody claims there's a rabbit in the box, and their evidence just works for everything, as far as I can tell. And I think the same is true of the theistic arguments. It could work for theism, but it could also work for pantheism and all the other options. So it's the same kind of thing. We seem to be asking the question: is there a God in the box? And you seem to say yes, and I seem to say, well, the evidence you have seems to work for lots of different things. I don't see any reason to believe there's a God.
To me, pantheism is a form of theism, and it goes to saying that the universe itself is God, which is, again, I think you can rationally defend it. I just sitting down to defend one from the other would be an entire conversation.
Well, I'm going off of
to have, but at the same time, I will point to the fact that we do have the reality. I mean, what am I trying to say? It's perfectly rational for us to think that there is something intelligence running things, and that there are elements that are beyond the laws of physics, and we do have evidence.
Pantheism is from Bertrand Russell from Einstein and Spinoza, and they just believed in a universe, no consciousness there. So it's just an
those were things they believed. I understand.
Yes, so when I'm talking about pantheism, I'm talking about just an eternal, all-powerful universe, which just has some of the properties that you think God does without the consciousness.
Right. And that's, you're allowed to think that. So, all right. Did you want to have I guess, would that be your final word? Because I'm not sure what else to say from here, because we got a lot to digest.
Well, I definitely like to have a deeper conversation with you about the ideas of pantheism and theism and why all the arguments seem to work for both cases. Because if they do, then it seems like, since you agreed that my analogy with the box and the rabbit works, then that would mean that my position of atheism was actually reasonable and justified.
Yeah, and that means I have to think about all this, because again, we're in a tough conversation here. I have to think about all this. Do I even truly accept that pantheism is really an atheist position? I need to think about that. Although you're right that Bertrand Russell said a lot of things. And
Spinoza and Einstein.
Einstein, yeah. Well, Einstein's views were not quite pantheistic either. But all right, Spinoza, you're into the God of Spinoza. All right, that's a conversation we would have to have another night.
Okay.
It really would, but you've certainly raised a fair challenge there. I don't think the spaghetti monster comparison holds. I don't at all. And I'm not in the least bit convinced by the claim that, because we evolved, the way our eyes are put together, we sometimes have optical illusions, and how, we perceive. I've heard this line of thinking before. We perceive agency in things where agency doesn't exist. I don't find those arguments all that convincing on evidentiary grounds. I really don't. They seem very weak to me, and just like ideological explain-awayers of events that we have reason to think happened. But I think we can leave it there.
Sure. But I wanted to make out sure that I'd rather focus on the pantheism-theism debate than the near-death experiences debate. So if you're really going to spend some time thinking about it, spend more time on the pantheism question, because that's more interests me.
All right. I think that's fair. And I really would like to wrap it here. I'm getting tired. It's you have made a lot of good points. Let's get to it with each other on email over the next, because we'll bring you on again another time, assuming you want to.
Absolutely. And, thanks for having me on, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your fans, come on by. Everything I've said is true. We have friendly conversations with atheists all the time, despite what you may have heard. We just have certain elements of the community we frequently are at odds with, but we have atheist friends. We have atheists on our team. So anybody on your channel is welcome to come on over to our Discord chat server, or just come chat us out. I will mention that tomorrow night we're actually doing some light nerdery stuff and going to talk about Thanksgiving movies, so nothing bad there. Wednesday, John C. Wright, science fiction writer and philosopher, ex-atheist like myself, we'll be getting together and also talking about Thanksgiving and human spirituality and all that. So we're here every night. Please go subscribe to TJump's channel. The link is in the low bar, and we'll be on the Red Pill Religion blog. And here on YouTube, please give us a like. Please give us a subscribe. Find us on redpillreligion.com always, even if we disappear from YouTube. And God bless everybody.